Hello there, I'm Heidi Adams in for Esther Kitui Hewitt. It is Monday, July 18th, and this is Africa 54.
Sudan protesters blame the military for ethnic violence. Harassed, beaten, and finally expelled. A correspondent with The Economist speaks with VOA about challenges he and other journalists face covering the war in Ethiopia. And rising food and fuel prices stoke fear and leave millions of Africans facing food insecurity and may threaten the stability of African countries.
And we begin in Sudan, where flash floods triggered by seasonal torrential rains in the western Darfur region have killed at least 7 people, including children. That's according to the United Nations and an aid group. Heavy rains started late Friday in the Kas locality in South Darfur province. At least 100 houses in camps for displaced people collapsed or were partially damaged. The UN says so far at least 6,000 people have been affected by heavy rains and flooding in the provinces of South Kordofan, White Nile and Kassala since the beginning of the rainy season in June. Sudan's rainy season usually lasts until September. Well, staying in that country, security forces there have fired tear gas as protesters marched on Sunday against military leaders who they blame for an outbreak of violence in a southeastern province. David Doyle has more.
Carrying signs reading "Stop Civil War" and "Blue Nile is Bleeding," Sudanese protesters marched amid clouds of tear gas on Sunday. The country's anti-military movement, which has been protesting since a coup in October last year, blames Sudan's rulers for an outbreak of violence in Blue Nile state. More than 30 people have been killed and 100 injured, the UN and Sudanese officials say, in bloodshed that started last week. The clashes are between the Hausa and Fung tribes in the southeastern state that borders Ethiopia. There have been sporadic outbreaks of violence in several parts of Sudan despite a nationwide peace deal signed with some rebel groups in 2020. Protesters have accused the military of stoking internal conflict and failing to protect civilians. Ahmed was among demonstrators in the capital Khartoum and said there had been a lot of excessive and extreme violence, but that the revolution continues. Military leaders have said the October takeover was necessary to preserve Sudan's stability amid political infighting. They say they're working to build on the 2020 peace deal. Authorities on Sunday said they would reinforce security in Blue Nile State and investigate the clashes. A curfew has been declared in 2 towns.
Well, David Doyle of Reuters filed that report. Moving to East Africa now. Kenya's deputy president and presidential contender William Ruto held interviews with the international media on Monday. This comes just weeks ahead of the East African nation's presidential elections. Kenyans go to the polls on August 9th. Ruto says he is confident of a victory.
I mean, this is a competition, and we are a democratic nation. I mean, there are 2 sides to government. There is the executive and there is the opposition. So, I mean, I think from where I sit now is we will certainly control Parliament and we will certainly control the Senate. I know there are notions that, you see, if you put the current president and the current leader of the opposition on one side, it becomes unassailable. I tell you, nothing could be further from the truth. The people of Kenya can cut through that kind of network and still make an informed decision. And I am very confident that I will win this election.
Well, Ruto says his campaign has largely managed to pull away from the usual competition around ethnicity and is focused on issues such as the cost of living, the economy and job creation. Meanwhile, his rival presidential candidate Raila Odinga and running mate Martha Karua addressed corruption, fair elections and social justice during their press conference with international media outlets in Nairobi.
If people see that the process is free and fair up to the polling day, after the tallying and the announcement of the results, there really should be no fear of violence erupting. In the process, we met, we discussed, and we agreed that the country was greater than both of us, and that we can work together to bring the country together and create peace so that the country can realize more development. I am not anybody's project. I am the people's project in these elections.
Well, Martha Karua, Odinga's running mate and veteran Kenyan politician, also spoke. She said their administration will view everything through the lens of social justice. 2 cases of the deadly Marburg virus have been identified in Ghana. Health authorities there say this is the first time the Ebola-like disease has been found in the West African nation. Earlier in the month, blood samples taken from 2 people in the southern Ashanti region suggested the Marburg virus. The samples were sent to the Pasteur Institute in Senegal, which confirmed the diagnosis. The Ghana Health Service, or GHS, said no treatment or vaccine exists for Marburg, which is almost as deadly as Ebola. Its symptoms include high fever as well as internal and external bleeding. A total of 98 people identified as contact cases are currently under quarantine. The GHS says no other cases of Marburg had yet been detected in Ghana. Harassed, beaten and finally expelled. Tom Gardner, a correspondent with The Economist, speaks with VOA Salem Solomon about challenges he and other journalists face covering the war in Ethiopia.
From pro-government rallies in the capital Addis Ababa to protests in the U.S. capital Washington, hostility toward media covering Ethiopia has been palpable since war broke out in Tigray in 2020, with accusations of false news and bias leveled at journalists in the streets and online. Foreign correspondents who came to Ethiopia to cover developments like the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam or the liberation of political prisoners say access has quickly evaporated.
Certainly after the war began, it became far, far more difficult than it had been before. Well, I was stopped from going to Tigray last year. I was prevented from going.
That's Tom Gardner, a correspondent for the British newspaper The Economist. The Ethiopian government expelled him from the country in May. Gardner has covered Ethiopia for 5.5 years. Then came political turmoil and protests, and with it, harassment.
Then there was always problems with, or potential problems with police, local security forces. I had run-ins with the police and in Amhara, for instance, last year.
In July 2021, police detained Gardner and a colleague. Gardner, in a later account, recalled being hit in the head with a rifle butt and seeing his friend's mouth fill with blood as officers beat him while bystanders jeered. While reporting in Ethiopia, Gardner came under attack in other ways too. Online harassment, attempts to discredit his reporting, and finally a letter from the Ethiopian Media Authority revoking his credentials and giving Gardner 48 hours to leave.
The government was incredibly vague in the letter they gave me revoking my license. They referred to sort of unspecified, unprofessional behavior, breach of ethics, mistaken approach to reporting.
The spokesperson for Ethiopia's prime minister did not respond to VOA's request for comment, but the government has pushed back on criticism from rights groups over media arrests and harassment, saying it is fighting disinformation and terrorist propaganda. In a speech in June, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed accused journalists of fomenting violence.
Let's not designate individuals engaged in destroying national institutions as activists and journalists.
When Simon Marks, a reporter for the New York Times and VOA, was expelled under similar circumstances in May 2021, he said arrests and beatings were hampering the confidence of colleagues. Media rights groups agreed, adding that expelling or harassing foreign correspondents sends a chilling message to local media.
What does that mean for the journalists operating already in Ethiopia, whether they be local or international? They must ask themselves the question, if this can happen to him, what could potentially happen to me?
Already, the risk of arrest is high. The state-funded Ethiopian Human Rights Commission says authorities detained 54 media workers between July 2021 and May 2022. Salim Salomon, VOA News, Washington.
Rising food and fuel prices driven by the war in Ukraine have stoked fear and left millions of Africans facing food insecurity and threatening the stability of countries across the continent. Paul Ndio has more.
The ripple effects of US-led sanctions against Russia have led to soaring commodity prices, leaving millions of people, especially in Africa, at risk. For example, data published by the United Nations shows that 32% of Africa's total wheat imports from 2018 to 2020 came from Russia and 12% from Ukraine. More than a dozen African countries currently rely on imports from Russia and Ukraine for more than 50% of their wheat supply. Somalia and Benin rely on Russia and Ukraine for 100% of their wheat supply. According to the International Committee of the Red Cross, about 346 million people in Africa are facing a severe food insecurity. Kapumba Shula, a Zambian economist, says the US-led sanctions imposed on Russia have led to soaring prices for essential commodities.
It's the fuel price. And that's affected because Russia is a major supplier of oil, and the sanctions that are being placed on Russia have repercussions on the global energy price. Secondly, it will be on commodities. Ukraine is a major wheat exporter around the world, so it exports a lot of wheat, and that affects commodity prices.
Analysts say the effects of sanctions on Russia and monetary policy being pursued in the US to prevent the country from tipping into recession are also impacting the global economy. That includes the appreciation in value of the dollar following significant interest rate hikes by the Federal Reserve in a bid to tame inflation.
Any economic issues in the US are likely to affect not only Africa but the entire world. And remember, the currency, the most global currency that is used in the world is a US dollar. And therefore, if you get an inflation in the US, it will have an impact on all of us in terms of supplies and so many things.
In June, Zambia's President Hakainde Hichilema told the European Parliament in Brussels that his country is well pressed to weather the global food crisis worsened by the war in Ukraine.
As the world faces critical shortages of key agricultural produce, and as we witness the devastating effects of food insecurity in all our regions of Africa and beyond, these three things are challenging our own economic reconstruction efforts: food prices, fuel prices, and fertilizer prices. And they're beginning to drive the cost of living, which will impact negatively more on the very poor that we would like to support to improve their living standards.
The West accuses Russia of blocking vital grain shipments from Ukraine to force clampdowns on sanctions over the war affecting its economy. Hichilema, whose government inherited 17.3 billion in debt when he was elected last year, is working to restore battered relations with donors and restructure the loan. Zambia was the first country in Africa to default during the COVID pandemic. Paul Ndiho, VOA News, Washington.
Well, we are excited to hear what you think about Africa 54 and all our VOA Africa programs on our website at voaafrica.com. Still to come here on Africa 54, Senegal's underwater museum that spotlights environmental problems. But first, let's take a look at what's coming up on this week's Straight Talk Africa. On the next Straight Talk Africa, what's behind the spate of mass shootings in South Africa? As police hunt the gunmen who went on killing sprees in bars and taverns, communities are directing their anger at police for failing to curb violent crime. We'll also discuss the life and legacy of the late José Eduardo dos Santos, who ruled Angola for nearly 4 decades. As Angolans prepare to go to the polls in August, we'll look at key moments of dos Santos' regime and how he shaped Angolan society and politics. Join me, Heidi Adams, on the next Straight Talk Africa. Well, let's take a look at some of the headlines you might have missed. Tigrayan rebels have set up a team to negotiate with the Ethiopian government. The announcement by the spokesperson for the TPLF on Monday comes less than a week after an Ethiopian government body tasked with examining the possibility of peace talks with the TPLF held its first meeting. Britain's Prince Harry addressed the UN General Assembly at its annual celebration of Nelson Mandela International Day. The General Assembly established July 18th, which is Mandela's birthday, as an international day to honor the late South African president. And authorities in Zambia have extradited a Chinese citizen who fled Malawi last month over accusations he sold exploitative videos of Malawian children to China. Police in Malawi told VOA Sunday that their counterparts in Zambia handed over Luque to them Saturday night. Many Americans are under-vaccinated and at risk of severe outcomes from COVID-19 as cases rise across the country. This assessment is from the director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, commonly known as the CDC. Experts say subvariants of the Omicron strain are to blame. As VOA's Arash Arabasadi reports, a new vaccine could help boost immunity numbers.
The nation's most populous county may soon travel back to a time of mask mandates due to COVID-19. Los Angeles is home to more than 10 million people, and its county health director recently said it faces a return to indoor masking if hospital admission rates continue climbing.
Local jurisdictions, cities, counties, states should make decisions about mask mandates because communities are different and their patterns of transmission are different. That said, CDC has very clear guidance on this as well through their COVID community levels. And the CDC recommendation is that when you're in a high zone, that sort of orange zone, as LA County is, people wearing masks indoors is really important, and it really will make a difference.
Last week, the Food and Drug Administration, or FDA, granted emergency use authorization for the Novavax COVID-19 vaccine. It's a more traditional vaccine as opposed to the mRNA style available through much of the pandemic. Instead of teaching cells how to make a protein to trigger immune response, Novavax is a direct injection of that spike protein.
Novavax, that was the only one that was a true consideration, that based on the protein that is in Novavax vaccine, that was something that I wanted to be a part of.
And while Novavax provides a new option for the vaccine hesitant, the White House says protection for many Americans is waning, and it may be time to again roll up our sleeves for a booster shot.
One of the key messages coming out of this moment is if you are 50 or over, and if you've not gotten a shot this year, in the year 2022, it is absolutely critical that you go out and get one now. It will offer a very high degree of protection.
U.S. health officials have warned the Omicron BA.5 subvariant, which makes up a large number of new cases, is more contagious than its predecessors and is able to circumvent existing immunity in many people, including from prior infection. Arash Arabasadi, VOA News.
U.S. President Joe Biden is back in Washington after meeting on the weekend with Arab leaders in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. He laid out his vision for U.S. engagement in the Middle East to counter Iran and reassert influence in the strategic competition against China and Russia. White House Bureau Chief Patsy Widakuswara traveled with the president. She filed this report from Jeddah.
Joe Biden chatting alongside Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, whose kingdom has a human rights record so poor, the U.S. president once called it a pariah.
What President Biden is doing is suggesting that human rights are cheap and can be bargained out for a range of other impact.
Was re-engagement worth the criticism of the Saudi visit and a fist bump with the Crown Prince? Biden appears to think so, saying that Washington's pivot away from the Middle East was a mistake.
We will not walk away and leave a vacuum to be filled by China, Russia, or Iran. We'll seek to build on this moment with active, principled American leadership.
At a summit in Jeddah, Biden and Arab leaders discussed energy security, but did not announce an increase in oil production to offset price hikes triggered by the war in Ukraine.
The kingdom will play its role in this field, as it has announced an increase in its production capacity to 13 million barrels per day. Thus, the kingdom will not have any additional capacity to increase production.
Biden laid out the principles of U.S. engagement in the region, strengthening partnerships, supporting defense capabilities, deterring powers who seek to dominate through military action or jeopardize freedom of navigation. Biden praised the truce in Yemen between the Saudi-led coalition and Tehran-backed Houthis, vowing to reduce tensions and end conflicts where possible. He told the roomful of men that the future belongs to countries where women can exercise equal rights
and contribute to building stronger economies, resilient societies, and more modern and capable militaries.
The U.S. announced $1 billion in food security assistance for the Middle East and North Africa. As Washington launches its global infrastructure plan to counter China's Belt and Road Initiative, Biden also welcomed Gulf leaders' $3 billion pledge for the program. Patsy Widakuswara, VOA News, Jeddah.
Well, back to the continent now. Senegal has opened an underwater museum just off the coast from its capital, Dakar. Its goal, to raise awareness of environmental problems in the bay. Alison Fernandez explains in this report, narrated by Carol Gunsberg, with video by Mbare Ndir.
The Oceanium, a Senegalese scuba diving center and NGO specializing in environmental protection, has just set up West Africa's first underwater art museum. About 100 meters off Dakar's shore, 8 sculptures were installed last December. Scuba diving offers the best way to see the sculptures in waters often clouded by pollution and cluttered with plastic bottles and other debris.
We think that by creating this museum, we will create awareness, because as soon as you say art, people move. These sculptures are made from ecological material.
The material is a type of clay, says art marketer Ouidia. 6 months after its installation, the sculptures are covered with marine life like barnacles that filter and cleanse the water.
So that means restoration is at work.
Artificial reefs provide habitat for marine life, with food and shelter encouraging reproduction. That could help counter the overfishing that has depleted the bay. The Underwater Art Museum is the brainchild of Radwan El Ali, director of the diving club. The club takes other steps to aid the environment. On this morning, El Ali and a team of other divers descend 25 meters to remove 2 fishing nets attached to sunken ships. Fish and other sea creatures can get tangled in the nets and die. It's dangerous for divers, too.
The first risk is that we cling to the net and get stuck. That's why there has to be at least 2 divers, one watching while the other works. The second risk is when we inflate the parachute to lift the net. If the net catches us, we go up without stopping, so we can have a decompression accident.
After 45 minutes underwater, the divers bring up a nylon net stretching roughly 100 meters long and about 20 meters wide.
There was a moray eel that died eating a fish. The fish is still in it.
Last year, El Ali and his divers pulled 25 tons of fishing net out of the sea. Fishing is vital to Senegal, employing roughly 600,000 people and serving as a main protein source nationwide. But the sector is in crisis from overfishing by individuals and industrial fleets.
Les gens ont faim, les gens se battent de plus en plus pour...
People are hungry, fighting more and more to live, even to survive. And today, we lose a ton of fish every year to nets.
Une tonne de poissons à l'année qui sont perdus.
El Ali estimates his organization removes 30 to 40 abandoned nets each year. He said Oceanium hopes to get financial support so it can continue its environmental work. For Alison Fernandez in Dakar, Senegal, Carol Gunsberg, VOA News.
And finally, news from the world of sport. Uganda's Joshua Cheptegei delivered a masterclass of unpanicked front-running to retain the men's world 10,000 meters title in Oregon on Sunday. Cheptegei, also the world record holder, led for large periods of the race and held off all challengers on the final lap at Eugene's Hayward Field to clock a winning time of 27 minutes, 27.43 seconds. Kenya's Stanley Waitaka Mburu claimed silver, with another Ugandan, Jacob Chiplimo, taking bronze in an unusually close finish. Reigning Olympic champion Solomon Barege finished 5th, beaten to 4th by American Grant Fisher. Well done to the East African athletes. And that is our show for today. Be sure to watch Africa 54 on our website at voaafrica.com. From all of us here in Washington, thank you so much for watching. We'll see you tomorrow. Until then, goodbye.
Online harassment and abuse is a shared challenge to the full and equal participation of women and girls, one that spans hemispheres, from Honduras to Indonesia to right here in the United States. Online forms of gender-based violence have increased, facilitated by new and emerging technologies, but rooted in entrenched gender disparities. Online harassment and abuse have a chilling effect on women, girls, and other underrepresented or marginalized groups. It can lead to self-censorship or disengagement altogether. We can't afford to lose a diversity of viewpoints or women's voices, perspectives, and leadership, particularly at a time when, as we all know, democracy cannot be taken for granted, with the brave women and men of Ukraine fighting to preserve theirs.